The waves crashed violently against the base of the towering cliffs along the Pacific coastline, their thunderous symphony echoing through the salty breeze. From the edge of the scenic lookout near Big Sur, a crowd of tourists gathered, their murmurs blending with the wind. Some watched in awe, others with growing apprehension, as they strained to see a figure clinging desperately to a narrow ledge below. The man, stranded precariously on the jutting rock, waved his arms and shouted for help, though his cries were swallowed by the relentless roar of the ocean below. Amid the onlookers, someone moved unnoticed, a striking woman with wild, wind-swept curls and a quiet but purposeful demeanor. Dressed in worn, ill-fitting clothes, she exuded an aura that captivated anyone who happened to glance her way. Her name was Lila Monroe. Though her disheveled appearance marked her as an outsider among the neatly dressed tourists, her piercing blue eyes glimmered with an intensity that hinted at an untold story. Lila stood apart, her gaze fixed on the man below, while her mind raced with observations. Strength isn't found in what you hold on to, but in what you're willing to risk letting go, she thought to herself. The man on the ledge, clad in expensive outdoor gear, seemed ill-prepared for the danger he was in. From the snatches of conversation around her, Lila pieced together the story. He had leaned too far for the perfect photo and slipped. His name, whispered among the crowd, was Richard Beckett, a tech mogul from Silicon Valley. The ledge was dangerously unstable, situated on a curved outcropping that made any rescue from above nearly impossible. Several people speculated that even trained rescue teams might struggle to reach him. Lila's sharp eyes, however, picked up on more than just the logistical challenges. She saw the trembling in Richard's hands, the strain in his voice as panic crept into his movements. He was running out of time. Without hesitation, Lila slipped away from the crowd. Her feet carried her swiftly to a nearby rack of paragliding gear set up for tourists. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she unraveled a parachute. Though her outward appearance suggested a life of hardship, her fluid, confident motions betrayed a depth of experience no one in the crowd could have guessed. True freedom lies in those who dare to leap when others only watch, she thought, as she secured the harness to her slender frame. Ignoring the startled shouts of a rental operator, she stepped to the very edge of the cliff. With a final glance at the crowd, who were only just beginning to notice her, she launched herself into the void. The paraglider unfolded above her, catching the wind and lifting her effortlessly into the turbulent air. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the spectators as they watched the woman glide gracefully towards the stranded man. For Lila, the chaotic gusts along the cliffs were familiar companions. She seemed to anticipate each shift and swell, navigating with uncanny precision. When she finally reached the ledge, she executed a flawless landing, her boots touching down softly on the precarious perch. Richard stared at her in disbelief, his face pale and streaked with sweat. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice a mix of fear and relief. Lila smirked, brushing a strand of golden hair from her face. "Just someone who doesn't feel like seeing a headline about your demise today," she replied dryly. "Do you want to get out of here, or are you enjoying the view?" Richard nodded vigorously, his hand still trembling as he tried to steady himself. "Yes, of course, I want to get out of here, but how are you planning to do that?" "Trust me," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I'll secure you to the paraglider, and we'll both make it out of here. Just follow my lead." Richard swallowed hard, his gaze darting nervously between the ledge and the sheer drop below. "I've never flown before," he admitted weakly. "Good," Lila said with a faint smile. "That means you won't try to help." She worked quickly, strapping him into the harness with practiced efficiency. Though her fingers moved deftly, her voice softened as she looked him in the eye. "Listen carefully, Richard Beckett. You need to trust me completely. When I say jump, we jump. Got it?" He nodded, his breath shallow but steady. "Got it. 3, 2, 1. Together they leaped from the ledge. The wind swallowed them in an instant, a cold rush of air that yanked them into the sky. Lila's hands gripped the paraglider's controls, steering them away from the cliffs. For Richard, the initial terror began to fade as he clung to the harness, his eyes widening at the breathtaking expanse of the ocean stretching out before them. A laugh, nervous and disbelieving, escaped his lips. "I can't believe this is happening," he muttered. "You're incredible. Who are you?" Lila cast him a sidelong glance, her tone laced with dry humor. "I told you already, I'm just the drifter who saved your life. Now stop talking, or we're both going to end up in the drink." They glided safely toward the landing zone, the crowd below cheering as they touched down. Richard's feet hit the ground unsteadily, and he turned to face his rescuer with newfound admiration. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said, his voice shaking with sincerity. Lila shrugged nonchalantly, brushing past him as she returned the gear. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Just try to stay away from cliffs next time." Before Richard could say more, Lila melted into the crowd, her golden hair catching the sunlight as she disappeared from sight. For a brief moment Richard stood frozen, his heart pounding as he watched her retreating figure. Something about her stirred a longing he couldn't quite name, a sense that he'd just crossed paths with someone who would change his life forever. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the Pacific sky in hues of orange and lavender, Richard sat behind the wheel of his sleek silver Tesla Roadster. He drove aimlessly through the winding streets of Carmel by the Sea, his mind replaying the day's events. The rush of adrenaline, the awe-inspiring flight, and most of all, the enigmatic woman who had appeared out of nowhere to save him. All of it lingered like a vivid dream he couldn't shake. The thought of her, Lila Monroe, though he didn't yet know her name, gnawed at him. How could someone so extraordinary vanish so effortlessly? He parked outside a quaint, ivy-covered cafe and approached a group of locals describing the golden-haired stranger in worn clothes. But each inquiry was met with puzzled looks and shaking heads. As the night deepened, Richard found himself wandering along a cobblestone path that led to a historic stone bridge overlooking the crashing waves below. His steps were hesitant, drawn forward by an inexplicable pull. Underneath the bridge, nestled in the shadows, he caught sight of a figure sitting alone. The faint glow of moonlight illuminated her unmistakable profile. Golden curls cascading to her shoulders, her form silhouetted against the gentle lapping of the tide. It was her. Richard's heart thudded as he approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. Lila, sensing his presence, turned her head slightly, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. "I didn't think I'd see you again," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the distant waves. Her lips curved into a wry smile. "Funny, I thought you'd be on a private jet back to Silicon Valley by now." He chuckled nervously, stepping closer. "I couldn't leave, not without knowing more about the woman who saved my life." Lila leaned back, studying him with an unreadable expression. "Why does it matter? You're alive. That's what you wanted, isn't it?" Richard hesitated, his hands slipping into his pockets. "It's not just about that. You didn't have to risk your life for me, yet you did. And now I can't stop thinking about why." She laughed, the sound light, but tinged with a trace of bitterness. "Don't overthink it. Sometimes people act. No deep meaning, no grand motive." But Richard wasn't convinced. He crouched down to her level, his gaze earnest. "Then tell me your name. At least give me that." After a long pause, she relented. "Lila Monroe." He repeated her name softly, as if committing it to memory. "Lila, thank you for everything." She shrugged, her eyes drifting back to the horizon. "Don't mention it. Seriously, I mean it." For a moment they sat in silence, the ocean their only witness. Then, without warning, Richard stood and extended his hand. "Come with me." Lila raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "Where?" "Someplace warm, comfortable. "You shouldn't be out here tonight," he said, his voice laced with concern. She stared at him, her arms crossed. "And why would I trust you, Richard Beckett? Just because you're rich and famous doesn't mean I should follow you anywhere." Richard smiled faintly, lowering his hand but holding her gaze. "Because I trusted you when my life was on the line. Now, let me return the favor. Let me help you." There was a quiet sincerity in his tone that made Lila hesitate. Finally, she sighed and pushed herself to her feet. "Fine. But don't expect me to play Cinderella in some gilded palace of yours." He chuckled. "Fair enough. Let's go." Minutes later, they pulled up to the grand entrance of the Monterey Cliffs Hotel, a luxurious seaside retreat with its sprawling gardens and softly lit courtyards. Lila hesitated as Richard stepped out and walked around to open her door. "Wow," she said, glancing at the opulent facade. "A little over the top, don't you think?" Richard grinned, holding the door open for her. "Only the best for the woman who saved my life." As they entered the lobby, the staff greeted Richard with professional deference, though their eyes flickered with curiosity when they noticed Lila's attire. She straightened her posture, ignoring the judgmental stares, but Richard caught the subtle shift in her demeanor. "Lila," he said quietly as they approached the front desk, "you belong here just as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." She glanced at him, her guarded expression softening ever so slightly. After arranging for 2 suites, one for each of them, Richard turned to Lila and said, "Take your time to freshen up. When you're ready, meet me downstairs. Dinner's on me," she smirked, crossing her arms. "Trying to buy my gratitude with steak and champagne?" "Not at all," he replied smoothly. "Consider it a thank you, and maybe a start." With that, he left her to settle in. In her suite, Lila stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her reflection a stark contrast to the luxurious surroundings. After a long, hot shower, she let her golden curls fall naturally over her shoulders. She slipped into the elegant red dress Richard had insisted she pick out from the boutique downstairs, a garment she'd reluctantly chosen but now couldn't deny suited her perfectly. As she applied a touch of red lipstick, she caught her own gaze in the mirror. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of the confidence she thought she'd lost. "I am still me," she whispered to her reflection. Moments later, she stepped into the elevator, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. When the doors opened to the lobby, Richard was already waiting, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. His eyes widened slightly as he took her in, a look of genuine admiration crossing his face. "You clean up well," he said, offering his arm. Lila rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide the faint smile that tugged at her lips. "Don't get used to it." As they walked toward the hotel's restaurant, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Whatever had brought their paths together, it was only the beginning. The restaurant, with its panoramic view of the moonlit ocean, exuded elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung above tables adorned with white linens and flickering candlelight. A string quartet played softly in the background, the melodies weaving a serene ambiance. Lila felt the weight of the room's stairs as they entered. She knew she looked different, dressed in the red gown, her golden curls framing her face like a halo, but the attention still felt suffocating. Richard, ever perceptive, leaned in close. "Don't mind them," he murmured. "They're probably just jealous." Lila chuckled, her lips curving into a wry smile. "Jealous? Of what?" "Of me," he said with a smirk, "because I'm the lucky one who gets to dine with you tonight." She rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress the warmth that spread across her cheeks. A waiter escorted them to a private corner table by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was breathtaking, the waves shimmering under the moonlight, their rhythmic motion a soothing contrast to the quiet buzz of the restaurant. As they sat, Lila's guarded demeanor softened slightly. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to enjoy the moment, the faint clink of glasses and the low hum of conversation around them created a bubble of intimacy she hadn't expected. "So," Richard began, his voice breaking the comfortable silence, "tell me about you, Lila. Where are you from? How did you end up?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Out there, living the way you do?" Lila leaned back in her chair, her expression inscrutable. "You're awfully curious for someone who barely knows me." "Can you blame me?" he countered, his tone light but earnest. "You saved my life, and I don't even know what drives someone to do something so selfless." Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Pain, perhaps, or a memory she wasn't ready to share. She picked up her glass of water, swirling it absently before setting it down. "Let's just say I've seen enough to know that life is fleeting," she said finally. "When you've lost as much as I have, risking what little you have left doesn't seem so terrifying." Richard studied her, his curiosity tempered by a growing respect. He sensed that pressing further might break the fragile trust forming between them. Instead, he shifted the focus to himself. "I wasn't always this guy, you know," he said, gesturing to his tailored suit and polished demeanor. "I grew up in a small town in Nevada. My family didn't have much, but they taught me to work hard and dream big. Somewhere along the way, though, I got caught up in the chase. Money, success, recognition. It's funny how it all feels hollow now." Lila tilted her head, her interest piqued. "Why? Isn't this the life people dream of?" "Maybe," he admitted. "But after today, hanging on that ledge, I realized something. None of it matters if you don't have someone to share it with." His words hung in the air, their weight unmistakable. Lila held his gaze, her walls beginning to crack. For the first time that evening, she saw a glimpse of vulnerability in him that mirrored her own. They continued talking, their conversation flowing effortlessly as the night deepened. Richard shared stories of his rise in the tech world, the triumphs and the sacrifices. Leela, in turn, offered glimpses into her own journey, a life marked by hardship, but also resilience. After dinner, they strolled along the hotel's private beach, their shoes discarded as the cool sand cushioned their steps. The sound of the waves and the crisp night air created a sense of serenity neither had felt in years. "Do you ever think about starting over?" Richard asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Lila laughed softly. "Every day, but life doesn't always give you that choice." "Maybe it does," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Sometimes we just have to take the leap." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Is that what you're doing? Trying to start over?" He nodded, his expression earnest. "Maybe. And maybe I'm hoping you'll take that leap with me." Lila's breath hitched, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to dismiss his words, to retreat into the safety of her solitude. But another part, a part she hadn't let herself acknowledge in years, yearned for the connection he was offering. "You barely know me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And yet I feel like I've known you forever," he replied, stepping closer. The intensity of his gaze unsettled her, yet she didn't pull away. For a moment the world seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them under the vast expanse of stars. "Lila," he said softly, his voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty, "what do you say?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out at the ocean, its endless horizon mirroring the uncertainty of her own future. Then, with a faint smile, she turned back to him. "I say, we'll see." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either, and for now, that was enough. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Richard watched Lila from a distance as she stood barefoot at the water's edge, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of morning. In that moment he realized that meeting her had changed something fundamental within him. Lila, feeling his gaze, turned to face him. A faint smile played on her lips, as if she could sense his thoughts. "Ready for the next adventure, Beckett?" she called out. He grinned, walking toward her. "Only if you're leading the way." Together they faced the rising sun, the beginning of something neither of them could yet define, but both were willing to explore. Over the next few days, Richard and Lila remained at the Monterey Cliffs Hotel, their lives intertwining in unexpected ways. Each moment they spent together revealed another layer of who they were, flawed, resilient, and searching for something neither could name. Richard found himself gravitating toward Lila's honesty, her grounded nature a refreshing contrast to the polished, superficial world he usually inhabited. For Lila, Richard's willingness to listen, to genuinely see her without judgment, stirred emotions she'd long buried. One morning, as sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel's library, Lila sat curled up on a velvet armchair, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Richard entered, his phone in one hand, a bemused expression on his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Morning," she replied, raising her mug in greeting. "What's so funny?" He held up his phone, scrolling through a news article. "It seems your little cliff rescue has gone viral. There are videos, hashtags, #GuardianAngel is trending." Lila groaned, sinking deeper into her chair. "Of course it is. Can't anything stay private anymore?" Richard chuckled, sitting across from her. "You've become a legend overnight. People love a hero, Lila." "I'm not a hero," she said firmly, her tone tinged with irritation. "I just did what needed to be done. That's all." "Maybe," he said, his voice softening, "but that doesn't mean it wasn't extraordinary." She met his gaze, the sincerity in his eyes disarming her. Despite herself, she smiled. That afternoon they ventured out of the hotel, exploring the rugged beauty of the California coastline. Richard had insisted on showing Lila some of his favorite spots, hidden coves, windswept trails, and a quiet little diner perched on a cliffside. Over lunch, as they shared a plate of fries and watched seagulls circle overhead, Lila couldn't help but feel a sense of ease she hadn't experienced in years. "So, Mr. Beckett," she teased, leaning back in her chair, "what's next for you? Going back to your empire of innovation?" Richard laughed, shaking his head. "Honestly, I'm not sure. After what happened, I've been thinking about stepping away for a while, maybe focusing on something that actually feels meaningful." "Like what?" she asked, genuinely curious. He hesitated, then smiled. "I haven't figured that part out yet, but I think I'd like to help people, maybe even people like you, those who've faced more challenges than most of us can imagine." Her expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and admiration. "That's unexpected, but good. The world could use more people like that." "And what about you?" he asked, his tone gentle. "What's next for Lila Monroe?" She looked out at the horizon, her thoughts distant. "I don't know. I've spent so much time surviving, I've never really thought about what comes after." "Well," he said, leaning forward, "maybe it's time to start." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard surprised Lila with an impromptu bonfire on the beach. The flames danced against the darkening sky, their warmth a comforting presence as the ocean breeze swept through the air. "I didn't take you for the romantic type," Lila said, her tone light but teasing. Richard smirked, poking at the fire with a stick. "There's a lot you don't know about me." "Fair enough," she said, sitting cross-legged on the sand. "But you've got to admit this is a little dramatic." "Sometimes a little drama is good for the soul," he replied. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the crackling fire and the sound of the waves creating a soothing rhythm. Then, out of nowhere, Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "What's that?" Lila asked, intrigued. "Something I started keeping after the incident," he said, flipping it open. "A list of things I want to do. Goals, dreams, stuff I never made time for before." Lila raised an eyebrow. "A bucket list?" "More like a second chance list," he said with a grin. He handed her the notebook, and she scanned the entries. Some were lighthearted. Learn to surf, eat an entire pizza in one sitting, while others were deeply personal. One in particular caught her eye. "Find a way to matter to someone." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "This is honest. I didn't expect that." "I didn't either," he admitted. "But after everything, I realized I've been living for myself for too long. I want to change that." Lila handed the notebook back to him, her lips curving into a small smile. "Then maybe you're not as lost as you think." As the days passed, their connection deepened. They laughed, shared stories, and faced the parts of themselves they'd long ignored. For Lila, it was a reminder that vulnerability didn't have to be a weakness. For Richard, it was proof that even in the face of uncertainty, there was always a chance to start anew. On their final night at the hotel, as the stars glittered overhead, Richard turned to Lila. "Come with me," he said, his voice steady, but filled with hope. She hesitated, her instincts urging her to retreat. "Richard, don't overthink it," he interrupted gently. "I don't know where this will lead, but I do know that I don't want to walk this path without you." Her heart raced, the weight of his words pressing against her carefully built walls. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of more. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's smile was radiant, his relief palpable. "Okay?" "Okay," she repeated, a faint smile tugging at her lips. As they stood beneath the endless expanse of sky, the ocean stretching before them, it was clear that their journey was only just beginning. Together, they would face whatever came next, two souls bound by chance, hope, and the promise of something extraordinary. At that moment, a knock on the door pulled Elizabeth from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, still processing the whirlwind of the past few days. She approached the door and opened it, revealing Sean standing there, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that only enhanced his already distinguished presence. Sean's expression shifted instantly from composed to astonished. His eyes widened as they took in Elizabeth's transformation. She wore a floor-length red gown that hugged her figure elegantly, the fabric shimmering softly under the suite's lighting. Her golden curls cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face radiant with confidence and delicate makeup that accentuated her youthful features. For a moment, Sean was at a loss for words. Then, recovering slightly, he managed to speak, though his voice was tinged with awe. "Elizabeth, please do me a favor. Give me a spin." Amused, Elizabeth's lips curved into a playful smile. Without hesitation, she turned gracefully, the dress flowing around her like liquid fire, its hem swirling with every step. Her movements were effortless, each turn radiating elegance and charm. Sean stood rooted to the spot, his usual composure replaced by open admiration. When she finally faced him again, he exhaled softly, almost as if he'd forgotten to breathe. "You're absolutely stunning," he murmured. "No, beyond stunning. You look like you've stepped out of a dream." Elizabeth's playful nature sparked as she tilted her head, arching an eyebrow. "From vagabond rescuer to runway model? That's quite the leap, Mr. O'Sullivan. Have you ever considered a career in storytelling?" Sean chuckled, his admiration deepening. "If I did, you'd be my heroine, though I doubt you'd follow any script I'd write." Elizabeth's laughter was light, her voice carrying the spark of life that had always defined her. "You know me well already," she quipped. "Rules were made to be broken, after all." Sean's eyes never left hers as he responded, his tone more serious. "Elizabeth, I mean it. You're more than beautiful tonight. You're radiant, luminous, like every diamond and ruby in the world decided to reflect your essence." Elizabeth raised a hand in mock protest, her wit as sharp as ever. "Diamonds and rubies? Careful, Sean, or you'll inflate my ego. Let's not forget, I'm just a drifter wearing borrowed finery." Sean's smile widened. "Borrowed or not, Elizabeth, you've outshone every jewel in the room, and believe me, tonight, the real treasure is you." Her laughter echoed softly, the perfect balance of gratitude and humor. You'd better be careful with compliments like that, Sean. There was a mirror in my suite, and I might have blinded myself before even coming downstairs. Sean laughed heartily, his admiration for her only growing with every clever remark. He offered his arm, which she accepted with a small, knowing smile. Together they stepped out into the hotel hallway, their connection palpable. As they descended to the grand dining hall, their entrance was nothing short of cinematic. Elizabeth's gown shimmered like molten fire under the lights, her confident stride drawing every eye in the room. Beside her, Sean exuded the poise and magnetism of someone who commanded respect effortlessly. The entire restaurant seemed to pause as they entered, their presence impossible to ignore. True radiance doesn't come from jewels or finery. It shines from the essence of a soul, unafraid to embrace its worth. When they reached their table, a prime spot by a wall of windows overlooking the ocean, a waiter greeted them with impeccable politeness, presenting the menus with a flourish. Sean opened his and began to peruse the options with the ease of someone well-versed in fine dining. As he started to explain one of the dishes to Elizabeth, she leaned forward slightly, a glint of mischief in her eye. "Ah, yes, côte de bœuf grillée," she said, her pronunciation in flawless French, risotto al tartufo, tagliolini al nero di seppia, and, of course, pâté de foie gras. Sean froze mid-sentence, staring at her as if she'd just grown wings. "Wait, how do you know all this? And how is your French better than mine?" Elizabeth's lips curled into a sly grin. "I told you, Sean, there's more to me than meets the eye. I'm like an old gilded book. Most people are too afraid to open it, but those who do find stories they never expected." Sean leaned back in his chair, a look of wonder mixed with humor on his face. "So, not only are you a paraglider and a mystery wrapped in elegance, but you're also a language expert? Anything else I should know?" "Many things," she said, her tone teasing, "but you'll have to earn the answers." The waiter, who had been hovering discreetly, cleared his throat gently, signaling that he was ready to take their order. Elizabeth, without missing a beat, spoke up. "We'll have 2 côtes de bœuf grillées paired with a bottle of your finest Chardonnay." Sean raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Taking charge now, are we?" Elizabeth smiled, leaning back in her chair. Someone has to keep things interesting. Their conversation flowed as naturally as the wine that arrived at their table. Sean found himself captivated by Elizabeth's wit, her intelligence, and the occasional flashes of vulnerability that she allowed to surface. As the night wore on, Sean set down his glass, his expression turning thoughtful. "Elizabeth," he began carefully, "I have to ask, who are you really?" She paused, swirling the wine in her glass, as her gaze drifted toward the window. The playful glint in her eyes softened, replaced by something deeper. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, her voice quieter. "Because," Sean said earnestly, "you've captivated me. Every moment with you feels like discovering a new piece of a puzzle I didn't even know I was trying to solve." Elizabeth looked at him, her guard faltering for just a moment. "You really want to know?" she asked softly. "Yes," Sean replied, "more than anything." Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth set her glass down. She glanced out the window again, as if gathering her thoughts before turning back to him. Elizabeth met Sean's gaze, her expression now solemn, her playful facade set aside. "It's not a happy story," she said softly, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her wineglass. Sean leaned in, his tone steady and reassuring. "I'm here to listen, Elizabeth, no matter what it is." She sighed deeply, her eyes reflecting both pain and resilience. "I was born in Cantabria, in the north of Spain," she began, her voice carrying the weight of bittersweet memories. "It's a place where the mountains meet the sea, where the cliffs are as fierce as the waves that crash against them. That's where my love for adventure was born." Sean listened intently, every word drawing him deeper into her world. "My father, Martin Montano, raised me on his own after my mother died during childbirth. He was everything to me, kind, wise, and fiercely protective. He ran a shipbuilding business, a legacy passed down from my grandfather. It was a successful enterprise, but my father always believed that true wealth wasn't in material possessions. He taught me that giving back was the greatest treasure of all. A faint smile touched her lips as she spoke, the memories bringing a glimmer of warmth to her tone. He encouraged my love for the outdoors. I learned to paraglide as a teenager, and even though it terrified him to watch me leap from cliffs, he never stopped supporting me. For a while, life was beautiful, free. Her voice faltered, and she looked away for a moment, collecting herself. But then came Joaquin, my father's younger brother. He was the opposite of my father, cold, calculating, ambitious in the worst ways. My father trusted him, but I always felt something was off. Sean frowned, already sensing where the story was headed. Joaquin managed the finances of the business while my father focused on operations, Elizabeth continued. At first, everything seemed fine, but then came whispers of irregularities, funds disappearing, deals falling through. My father dismissed them as mistakes, too proud to consider that his own brother might betray him. But then, her voice grew quieter, tinged with bitterness. Then the authorities came. Sean's jaw tightened, his frustration on her behalf palpable. They accused my father of embezzlement and fraud, Elizabeth said, her voice trembling with emotion. Our accounts were frozen. Every asset we had was seized. My father was devastated, not just because of the charges, but because Joaquin refused to defend him. He took over the company, claiming it was to protect the family legacy. But I knew the truth. Joaquin was the one who orchestrated everything. He framed my father to take control. Elizabeth's hand gripped the edge of the table as she spoke, the anger and pain in her voice unmistakable. We had nothing left. No resources to fight the accusations. No way to prove my father's innocence. I tried to help him. I sold my paraglider, the one thing that gave me freedom, to hire a lawyer. But Joaquin found out. He gave me an ultimatum: leave and stop interfering, or he'd make sure I never saw my father again. Sean reached across the table, his hand brushing hers in a silent gesture of comfort. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "you didn't deserve any of that. Neither did your father." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I left," she said simply. "I thought it was the only way to protect him. I wandered, taking whatever work I could find, always hoping that one day I'd have a chance to make things right. And then I met you." Sean's grip on her hand tightened slightly, his determination evident. "Elizabeth," he said firmly, "we're going to fix this. We're going to prove your father's innocence and take back everything Joaquin stole. I promise you that." For the first time in years, Elizabeth allowed herself to hope. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. "Thank you, Sean," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The following morning they boarded a private jet bound for Bilbao. As the plane soared over the Atlantic, Elizabeth sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Sean sat beside her, reviewing documents and making calls to his legal team. "You're quiet," he said after a while, glancing at her. Elizabeth smiled faintly. "Just thinking. It's been so long since I've been home. I'm not sure what to expect." Sean reached over, resting a reassuring hand on hers. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." When they landed in Bilbao, the cool northern air greeted them like an old friend. Elizabeth stepped onto the tarmac, her green suit fluttering slightly in the breeze. She stood tall, her golden curls catching the sunlight. As she took in the familiar landscape, Sean joined her, his presence steady and grounding. "Welcome home," he said softly. Elizabeth's lips curved into a small, grateful smile. "It feels strange," she admitted. "Like I'm both coming back and starting over." "You're not starting over," Sean said firmly. "You're reclaiming what's yours." They arrived at a villa nestled in the hills of Cantabria, its stone walls and lush gardens exuding timeless elegance. Elizabeth took a deep breath as she stepped inside, the weight of the journey ahead pressing against her chest. After settling in, they made their way to the law office of Armando Rosado, a distinguished attorney Sean had hired to handle the case. The office was warm and inviting, with wooden shelves lined with legal texts and family photographs. "Mr. O'Sullivan, Ms. Montano," Armando greeted them warmly, rising from his desk. "It's an honor to meet you both. I've reviewed the case files your team provided, and I believe we have a strong foundation to begin building a defense for your father." Elizabeth nodded, her resolve firm. "What's our first step?" she asked. Armando gestured for them to sit. "We'll start by tracing the financial discrepancies and gathering evidence to disprove the charges against your father. I've already identified several transactions that raise questions about Joaquin's integrity. With enough evidence, we can challenge the original verdict." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Sean, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Then let's get started," she said. For weeks, Elizabeth and Sean worked tirelessly alongside Armando and his team. Late nights blurred into early mornings as they pored over financial records and pieced together the puzzle of Joaquin's betrayal. With every breakthrough, Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer the wandering drifter searching for answers. She was a woman fighting for justice, for her father, and for herself. 2 months later, the day of the hearing finally arrived. The courthouse in Cantabria buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, the air thick with anticipation. Elizabeth stood just outside the courtroom, dressed in a deep blue suit that perfectly reflected her poise and determination. Her golden curls framed her face, her expression resolute despite the weight of the moment. Beside her, Sean offered a steadying presence. His tailored suit and confident demeanor made him stand out, but his focus was solely on Elizabeth. "You're ready for this," he said quietly, his voice a calming force. Elizabeth nodded, taking a deep breath. "I've waited for this day for so long. It's time." The courtroom was packed. On one side sat Joaquin, his expression unreadable, but his unease evident in the stiffness of his posture. On the other side sat Elizabeth and Sean, their presence commanding attention. As the hearing began, Armando Rosado presented their case with precision. He laid out the discrepancies in the financial records, pointing to evidence that implicated Joaquin in the fraudulent transactions. The courtroom murmured as the details unfolded, the once powerful facade of Joaquin beginning to crack. But the turning point came when Manuel Ortega, a former accountant for the Montano family business, took the stand. "Mr. Ortega," Armando began, his tone firm yet respectful, "can you confirm your role within the company during the period in question?" "I was responsible for maintaining the financial record," Ortega replied, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "And were you ever asked to manipulate those records?" Ortega hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Joaquin before returning to Armando. "Yes," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I was instructed by Joaquin Montano to falsify documents and transfer funds to accounts overseas." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Joaquin's face turned pale, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Can you provide specific examples?" Armando pressed. Ortega nodded, producing documents that detailed the fraudulent transactions. The evidence was damning, each piece building a case that was becoming impossible to refute. As the judge examined the documents, Joaquin's lawyers scrambled to counter the testimony, but the cracks in their defense were too deep. Finally, Armando turned his attention directly to Joaquin. "Mr. Joaquin Montano, would you care to explain these transactions?" Joaquin stood, his face glistening with sweat. He attempted to deflect, offering vague justifications that only served to dig him deeper into the hole. Armando's questions grew sharper, each one chipping away at Joaquin's composure. In a final, desperate outburst, Joaquin slammed his hands on the table. "Fine," he shouted, his voice trembling with anger and defeat. "Yes, I did it. I framed Martine to save myself. Are you satisfied now?" The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the weight of his confession settling over everyone present. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. In the silence that followed, the judge declared Martín Montaño innocent of all charges. Joaquin, now exposed, was taken into custody, his fall from grace complete. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. The relief was overwhelming, years of pain and uncertainty finally giving way to vindication. She turned to her father, who sat just a few rows behind her, and rushed to embrace him. "Papa," she whispered through her tears, her voice trembling with emotion. "We did it. I promised you, and we did it." Martín held her tightly, his own tears falling freely. "Mi niña," he said softly, his voice filled with pride and love, "you never gave up. You've brought us back to life." Sean watched the reunion from his seat, his heart full as he witnessed the moment. When Elizabeth finally turned to him, her face still wet with tears, she walked over and threw her arms around him. "Sean," she said, her voice raw with gratitude, "this wouldn't have been possible without you. You didn't just help me save my father, you saved me too." Sean held her close, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You're the one who had the strength to fight, Elizabeth. I just gave you the tools. The rest was all you." As they pulled apart, Elizabeth smiled through her tears, the weight of years of struggle finally lifting. In the weeks that followed, life began to take on a new rhythm. Elizabeth and her father worked to rebuild the family business, their bond stronger than ever. Sean remained by her side, his support unwavering, as she reclaimed her place in the world. But 1 month later, Sean had one more surprise for Elizabeth. It was a golden evening on the cliffs of Moher, the wind carrying the salty tang of the Atlantic as waves crashed against the rocks below. Elizabeth stood near the edge, her white dress billowing in the breeze. The gown was simple yet stunning, its flowing fabric accentuating her graceful figure. Her hair was adorned with delicate jasmine flowers, their fragrance a subtle reminder of the journey that had brought her here. Sean stood a few steps behind her, his dark suit tailored to perfection. His eyes never left her as she gazed out at the horizon, the setting sun casting a warm glow over her features. When she turned to face him, her smile was radiant. "So," she said playfully, "are you ready for this?" Sean stepped closer, his own smile full of quiet certainty. "I've been ready from the moment I met you." With that, Elizabeth turned and ran toward the edge of the cliff. For a moment it seemed as if she might leap into the void, but then she unfurled a paraglider, a pristine white sail that caught the wind and lifted her effortlessly into the sky. The guests gathered below gasped in awe, their applause ringing out as Elizabeth soared above them. Sean wasted no time in following, strapping into his own paraglider and launching into the air. Together they glided above the cliffs, the vast expanse of ocean stretching endlessly beneath them. Sean reached for Elizabeth's hand, their fingers intertwining as they flew in perfect harmony. "Always ready to fly with you," he said, his voice carrying across the wind. Elizabeth laughed, her joy echoing in the open air. "Then let's see how far we can go." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the two of them soared onward, partners in every sense, their love as boundless as the skies they shared. Some stories don't end. They take flight, carrying those brave enough to leap into the unknown. The celebration that followed Elizabeth and Sean's wedding was a blend of elegance and unbridled joy. Set against the backdrop of the cliffs of Moher, the reception took place in a stunning open-air venue. Strings of lights hung between tall poles, casting a warm golden glow over the gathering as the sun set completely. Tables were adorned with simple yet exquisite centerpieces of white jasmine and deep green foliage, a nod to the flowers woven into Elizabeth's hair. The atmosphere was lively but intimate, with a select group of family and friends who had witnessed the extraordinary love story unfold. Sean, ever the gracious host, moved through the crowd with Elizabeth by his side, their hands intertwined. "I still can't believe you flew off a cliff in your wedding dress," he teased her, as they greeted another guest. Elizabeth laughed, the sound rich and full of life. "And I still can't believe you followed me," she retorted, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "But I suppose that's what makes us a perfect match." Sean grinned, pulling her closer. "I'd follow you anywhere, Elizabeth. You should know that by now." Later that evening, as the festivities began to wind down, Sean and Elizabeth stole away from the crowd. They wandered to the edge of the cliffs, the sound of the waves below creating a soothing rhythm against the distant hum of laughter and music. Standing side by side, they looked out over the darkened sea, the moonlight casting a silver sheen across the water. "You did it," Sean said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "You reclaimed everything that was taken from you, and more than that, you found yourself again." Elizabeth turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. "You gave me the strength to believe in myself when I felt like I had nothing left." He shook his head, brushing a stray curl from her face. "You've always been strong, Elizabeth. I just reminded you of it," she smiled, leaning into him as the wind tugged gently at her dress. "Do you ever think about how strange it all is? How one moment can change your life forever?" Sean chuckled. "Like falling off a cliff and being saved by a mysterious woman with golden curls?" Elizabeth laughed, nudging him playfully. "Exactly." Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence, the kind shared by two people who no longer needed words to understand each other. Finally, Elizabeth broke the quiet. "What's next for us, Sean?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and excitement. Sean's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Whatever we want," he said simply. "The world is ours, Elizabeth. We've proven we can face anything together." She nodded, a sense of peace washing over her. For the first time in years, she felt truly free, free from the shadows of her past, free to dream about the future. The following months brought a new chapter for Sean and Elizabeth. Together, they embarked on ventures that combined their strengths and passions. Sean with his business acumen, and Elizabeth with her resilience and creativity worked to create initiatives aimed at helping underprivileged communities. One such project was a foundation dedicated to providing resources for struggling families, inspired by Elizabeth's own experiences. The foundation offered scholarships, legal assistance, and mentorship programs, ensuring that others would have the support she had lacked during her darkest times. "I want this to be more than charity," Elizabeth told Sean one evening as they worked late in their office. "I want it to be a legacy, a reminder that even when life takes everything from you, there's still hope." Sean reached across the desk, taking her hand. "And it will be," he said, "because it's coming from you." Their efforts quickly gained recognition, and the foundation became a beacon of hope for countless people. But through it all, Sean and Elizabeth remained grounded, their bond unshaken by the challenges they faced. One day, as they sat together in their home, an inviting estate nestled in the Irish countryside, Sean brought up an idea that had been on his mind for some time. "Elizabeth," he began cautiously, "what would you think about starting a family?" She looked up from the book she was reading, her eyes widening slightly. "A family?" He nodded, his expression earnest. "I know it's a big step, but I can't help imagining what it would be like to raise a child together, to give them the kind of love and support we both missed at times in our lives." Elizabeth considered his words, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. She had spent so long fighting to reclaim her past that she hadn't allowed herself to think much about the future. But as she looked at Sean, she felt a sense of certainty that surprised her. "A family," she repeated softly, a smile slowly forming on her lips. "I think I'd like that." Sean's face lit up, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "You have no idea how happy that makes me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elizabeth laughed, holding him close. "I think I do." Months later, Elizabeth stood at the edge of a cliff once more. This time, however, the occasion was entirely different. Her hand rested lightly on her rounded belly, her expression a blend of wonder and contentment. Sean stood behind her, his arms wrapped protectively around her waist. "You're thinking again," he teased, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I can't help it," she admitted. "Standing here, it feels like everything has come full circle, like we're exactly where we're meant to be," he smiled, resting his chin on her shoulder. "That's because we are." As the wind swept through their hair and the waves crashed below, Elizabeth closed her eyes, savoring the moment. She had fought so hard to reach this point, to reclaim her life and build something new. And now, standing here with Sean and the life they had created together, she knew it had all been worth it. Some journeys begin with a fall, but the greatest ones are marked by how we rise. The years that followed were a testament to the life Elizabeth and Sean built together, a life rooted in love, resilience, and the unyielding belief that even the darkest pasts could give rise to the brightest futures. Their foundation flourished, touching lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. Elizabeth became a prominent advocate for justice and equality, often speaking at global conferences and sharing her story to inspire others. Her ability to connect with people, whether through humor, vulnerability, or sheer determination, earned her admiration from all who met her. Sean, ever the supportive partner, continued to expand his business ventures, but his focus shifted toward creating opportunities for those who needed them most. Together, they became a formidable team, their shared vision driving them to make a tangible difference in the world. One crisp autumn morning, Elizabeth stood in the kitchen of their home, her now 3-year-old daughter Clara perched on a stool beside her. Clara's golden curls mirrored her mother's, and her laughter filled the room as she helped Elizabeth mix batter for pancakes. "Careful, Clara," Elizabeth said, gently guiding her daughter's tiny hand away from the edge of the bowl. "We don't want a spill, do we?" Clara giggled, her eyes sparkling. "No, Mommy. Daddy says I'm the best helper ever." Elizabeth laughed, her heart swelling with love. "Daddy's right. You're the best helper in the whole world." As if summoned by their conversation, Sean entered the kitchen, his arms laden with a basket of freshly picked apples. "Good morning, my favorite girls," he said, setting the basket on the counter and leaning down to kiss Elizabeth on the cheek. "Daddy!" Clara exclaimed, reaching out to him with flour-covered hands. Sean laughed, scooping her up without hesitation. "You've been busy, haven't you? Are you making pancakes for me?" "For everyone," Clara declared proudly. Elizabeth smiled at the sight of them, her heart full. This was the life she had fought for, a life filled with love, laughter, and moments that felt like small miracles. Later that day, the family took a walk along the cliffs, a favorite tradition of theirs. Clara skipped ahead, her boundless energy keeping Sean and Elizabeth on their toes. "Careful, Clara," Sean called out, his protective instincts kicking in. "I'm careful, Daddy," Clara called back, her voice carried by the wind. Elizabeth chuckled, slipping her hand into Sean's. "She's fearless, just like you." "Like us," Sean corrected, squeezing her hand gently. "She gets her courage from both of us." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the vast expanse of ocean stretching out before them. As they reached a familiar spot, a secluded outcropping where they often stopped to take in the view, Clara plopped down on the grass, her giggles subsiding as she looked out over the water. "Mommy, Daddy," she said thoughtfully, "why is the ocean so big?" Elizabeth smiled, sitting down beside her daughter. "Because it's full of possibilities," she said. "Just like you, Clara. There's no limit to what you can do or be." Clara considered this for a moment, her small face serious. "Can I fly like you and Daddy someday?" Sean sat beside them, wrapping an arm around Elizabeth's shoulders. "If that's what you want, Clara," he said, his voice steady and full of love, "we'll make sure you have the wings to do it." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. The family lingered on the cliffs, their laughter and conversations blending with the sound of the waves. Elizabeth leaned against Sean, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's funny," she said softly. "I used to think the best moments of my life were behind me, but now I see the best moments are the ones we create together." Sean kissed her temple, his voice low but full of conviction. "We've only just begun, Elizabeth. There's so much more ahead." She turned to him, her smile radiant. "Then let's keep flying, Sean." "Together." He nodded, his eyes shining with love. "Always." As the last light of day faded into twilight, Elizabeth, Sean, and Clara sat hand in hand, their hearts full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here, and for the limitless horizons that still lay ahead. Because some stories don't end, they continue to soar, carried by the strength of love, resilience, and the unyielding belief in what's possible.